Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where Phil Lee, a partner from Field Fisher, and James Eyre, a strategic account director from Insighton, will be discussing GDPR and ePrivacy site compliance. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we will be touching on the key provisions related to website data collection and how we can put all that into practice. Throughout the webinar, we'll be running a few polls to understand how you are viewing and approaching GDPR and giving you all the results. So you'll see something come up on your screen and you'll be able to select A, B, C, or D, and then at the end we'll give you the results. And right at the end of the webinar also, we'll be having a live Q&A with Phil and James. So please enter your questions via the chat because all the lines are currently muted. The final thing to say is the session's being recorded and will be sent to all registered attendees at the end of the webinar. So if we go to the first poll, I will set this up. So this is how prepared you are for the GDPR enforcement beginning on May the 25th. So please put your answers in. Right, I'll close the poll there. Somebody's actually got their line open, so if you could put it on mute, thank you. So the results are that very prepared, we're all set, comes in at 9%, somewhat prepared comes in at 50%, not very prepared at 39%, and 2% not very prepared at all. So most of you are sat into the middle. Right, moving on to our first speaker today. I'm very pleased to introduce Phil. If we can hop on to the next slide, please, James. Phil Lee is a partner from the Privacy, Security and Information Group at Field Fisher. They currently have 50 people in this group, so it's a massive group growing day in, day out with the demand on their services. He develops and manages clients' transatlantic and wider data privacy compliance programs, and in fact founded Field Fisher's Silicon Valley office. He has an MA in computer science from Cambridge University and a postgrad in intellectual property from Bristol University. So I'll hand over to Phil for the first session. Thank you, Phil.
Hi, thank you very much, Ian, for that introduction. And just in case anyone's wondering, I would just like to let you know that it wasn't me who was the 2% for praying for an extension. So I am here today to talk to you a little bit about the GDPR and what it's going to mean for online tracking after May the 25th. James, perhaps you can take me forward to the next slide. There we go. Right, so what I wanted to do before we just get into the GDPR and its sort of sister piece of legislation, the ePrivacy Directive, and how that will impact cookies, I wanted just to kind of set the scene and give a bit of a background about how we've got to where we are. I mean, the starting point with all of this is to think, why did the GDPR actually come about? And the short answer to that is that the current law that regulates the collection and use of people's personal information in the EU, the Data Protection Directive, is showing its age. It was actually adopted back in 1995, which was a very different technological era to the environment that we have today. And just to kind of put that into context, 1995, for those of you that will remember, was the year that Lady Diana announced her affair to James Hewitt on national television. It was the year that Toy Story was released at the cinema. And for those of you that are Manchester United fans, it was also the year that Eric Cantona kung fu kicked a Crystal Palace fan in a football match. And so you may remember those events, and you may remember that they were a long time ago. And they were also at a time when none of us were really using the internet or mobile phones or cloud computing or doing online shopping, banking, or any of those funky things that we all take for granted nowadays. But the reality of it is that the law that was adopted back then is the law that is regulating everything that we do today. And so a few years back, the European Commission recognized that the existing European data protection framework needed to be updated to kind of adopt a law that was fit for the 21st century. And so its solution to that was the GDPR. Now, it's important to understand, though, that when we talk about online tracking and the use of things like cookies and pixels and scripts and all those clever pieces of technology, the GDPR isn't the only piece of law that regulates that. In fact, there are two laws that you need to know about, and they kind of work hand in hand. So one of them is obviously the GDPR, and the GDPR is the pan-European legislation that's coming into force on May the 25th that sets out rules governing the collection and use of personal data. And the GDPR applies to businesses that are data controllers, meaning that they decide what data they're going to collect and how they're going to use it, and also to data processors, meaning organizations that are processing data on behalf of another organization, that other organization being the data controller and the service provider being the data processor. And the GDPR applies to both and has rules for both. And the GDPR applies more or less uniformly throughout all EU member states. And of course, the bit that everybody tends to know about the GDPR is that it has these enormous, great big fines if you're non-compliant. And so people are very concerned about that, and that's what's driven a lot of the compliance activity over the past sort of 18 to 24 months. Now, alongside that, we also have another law called the Privacy and Electronic Communications Directive, or sometimes referred to as the ePrivacy Directive. And that actually is a law that's been around since 2002. You might better know it as the Cookie Directive, is what it's often referred to. That law was adopted in 2002, and back then it contained requirements for cookies and said that if you were serving cookies, you had to tell people and give them the ability to opt out. So back in 2002, what people started doing was including sort of a short paragraph in their privacy notices that said that if that websites were using cookies, and if as a user you didn't like that, you could change your browser settings and stop the cookies. Then in 2009, that ePrivacy Directive was updated, and it introduced a requirement that you had to get consent for cookies going forward. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But now there's a lot of question about how the ePrivacy Directive interfaces with the General Data Protection Regulation, because you can kind of think of the GDPR as being like the baseline data protection law, and the ePrivacy Directive is layering on top of that an extra set of rules that govern privacy over communications channels. And so the ePrivacy sets very specific rules for the use of cookies and e-marketing. And the other thing to know about the ePrivacy Directive is that unlike the GDPR, it is not one law that just automatically applies in all EU member states. It actually has to be individually implemented in every country. So each country passes its own national version of the ePrivacy Directive. And what that results in is the effect where every country has slightly different approaches and slightly different rules about how they think cookies and tracking should work. Now, what you should understand from all of this then is that when we talk about the use of tracking technologies like cookies, the first place you need to go to look to find out what those rules say is actually in the Privacy Directive. And the relevant language is up here on the screen. And you can see that it says that the storing of information or the gaining of access to information stored in the terminal equipment of a user is allowed only on condition that the user has given his or her consent, having been provided with clear and comprehensive information. Now, there's a few things to note from you. This is what we call the cookie consent rule, and there's a few things to note from this. The first thing is that it actually never uses the word cookies once. What it talks about is the storing of information or the gaining of access to information already stored. So that language... We've got a gremlin in the system by the looks of things. So that information, that language, storing of information or gaining of access to information is certainly broad enough to include cookies, but it's also broad enough to include other forms of tracking, whether that is the use of pixels or scripts or digital fingerprinting. All of those things are kind of captured by that language. The second thing to know is that although it sets a general requirement for consent for cookies and similar tracking technologies, the language kind of goes on, I haven't got it on the screen here, but the language goes on to say that if you are setting cookies for strictly necessary purposes that have been explicitly requested by the user, then then you do not need to get consent. And that's a very, very narrow exemption. Regulators have essentially said that it allows the use of cookies for things like maintaining shopping baskets on websites or providing secure logins to websites, but pretty much any other use of cookies, including sort of analytics, advertising, personalization, all of those things still require consent. Now, you may be thinking at this point, well, the ePrivacy Directive seems pretty clear. We've got to get consent for cookies. So where does the GDPR come into this? Well, the reason the GDPR comes into this is that the ePrivacy Directive says that you've got to get consent, but it doesn't say what consent looks like. And the actual definition of consent is provided in the GDPR. So if we go over to the GDPR now, you'll see we've got Article 4 here, which says that consent of the data subject means any freely given, specific and informed it's freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data subject's wishes. And then in the recitals, which you can think of as being like explanatory text to the GDPR, they say that consent should be given by a clear affirmative act, and silence, pre-tick boxes, or inactivity do not amount to consent. So there's a few things to note here. The first is that consent has to be unambiguous. And actually, this is a change from the current law. Under the current legislation, where the requirement for consent is only that it's freely given, specific and informed. But the GDPR says that it has to now be those things, and also it has to be unambiguous. And so you start to think to yourself, well, what does unambiguous mean? And that's where the explanatory recitals are helpful, because they say that unambiguous means there has to be a clear affirmative act. It's not enough just to assume that people's silence or that you can get people's consent through their silence or through the use of pre-tick boxes. There has to be some affirmative action taken on the part of the user that indicates their consent. And we'll revisit that in a second. So what are the models that people are using for getting consent to cookies and trackers today? Well, broadly speaking, there are two models. There is the opt-in model, which is where when you visit a website, some kind of pop-up appears that asks you to agree to the use of cookies and similar tracking technologies. And there is a clear affirmative action taken to indicate consent. You normally have to click a button, say, yes, I agree to cookies, or something along those lines. That's very clearly an opt-in approach to cookies and very clearly compliant. The problem is that although I say it's a model that's used today, it's used by almost nobody. And the reason it's used by almost nobody today is just simply that the other model that people use is this implied consent model, which is generally seen as being more favorable because it is less intrusive on the user experience when you land on the website or an app. So the implied consent model is slightly different. And what it works on today is that when you land on a website, you get a banner that's displayed at the bottom of the screen. And it basically discloses the fact that the website is using cookies and tracking technologies and why it's using them. And then it goes on to say something like, if you continue browsing the website, then this will indicate your consent. Now, there's a question around this implied consent model as to whether continued browsing amounting to consent constitutes a clear affirmative action under the GDPR. And I'll give you my thoughts on that in just a second. But just to show you examples of these models in practice, here's a screenshot from Nike's website. And you can see Nike have taken an opt-in approach to cookies. So if you land on their website and you're a visitor from the EU, the first thing you see is this screen that comes up that says your cookie settings. And it asks you to actually click to say, yes, I accept cookies, or there's a link you can click on for more information. The alternative approach, an implied consent approach, is actually taken here by the Information Commissioner's Office. And you can see what it does is there's this little thing that pops up in the left-hand corner that says, we have placed cookies on your device to help make this website better. You can use this tool to change your cookie settings, otherwise we'll assume you're okay to continue. So in other words, they're basically just telling you they're dropping the cookies anyway, and they're assuming if you continue to navigate without changing your settings, that you're okay with cookies. That's the implied consent model. So what does the GDPR mean for cookie banners? We've got those two models today. Well, if we focus particularly on the implied consent model, the way that it works today is that a user lands on the site. The second they land on the site, cookies are dropped on them and a banner is served. And the banner explains to them that their continued use of the website will amount to their consent. Their consent is effectively implied by the fact they continue to use the website without changing the cookie settings. But the important point to note there is that cookies are dropped, before or at the same time the banner is served. They're not delayed. Now, if you remember that the GDPR says that you've got to have unambiguous consent and that there has to be a clear affirmative action to indicate consent, to me, the really significant impact of the GDPR is that it impacts when those cookies need to be dropped. So, you know, the order of events ought to be that the user lands on the site, they're served a banner or a notice informing them about the use of cookies, and then they have to take some consent action before those cookies are dropped. Now, what that consent action looks like might be an opt-in, like the Nike approach, where you have to say, yes, I agree to cookies, or possibly it could still be an implied consent approach where it's indicated that continued use of the website amounts to cookies, but you must not drop the cookies until there has been some action to indicate there's been continued use of the website, like somebody clicking on a link. I think that's the real difference. So practical takeaways from what we've talked about so far, you know, online data collection is governed both by the GDPR and the ePrivacy Directive, and it's the ePrivacy Directive that sets out the requirement for consent for cookies and trackers. But the GDPR, which says that that consent has to be given, it has to be unambiguous and given through clear affirmative actions. And if you are going to use an implied consent approach rather than a strict opt-in approach, you need to think very carefully about the timing of your cookie drop and make sure it doesn't happen until the user has taken whatever action it is that you're describing as consent for the use of cookies. But just to note, that's not all. The ePrivacy Directive is also undergoing reform, and at some point next year, we're expected to see a new ePrivacy regulation. So in the same way that the current Data Protection Directive has been updated to get a GDPR, we're going to have the ePrivacy Directive updated to create an ePrivacy regulation. That will update the cookie consent rules, and in particular, it's looking to place a greater emphasis on browsers and mobile OSs to get consent, rather than necessarily having to get them on a website-by-website basis. However, there are a huge amount of legal and technical difficulties to what's being proposed here, and it's very uncertain whether or not those proposals will actually even survive into the final legislation. But whatever happens, you should be paying careful attention to the development of the regulation and the way that it may further impact cookie consent rules in a year's time. So with that, we'll move on to our second interactive poll question. So this is a question for you all. What cookie consent model is your organization intending to adopt after the GDPR? Are you A, going to use the prior opt-in cookie consent pop-up? Are you B, going to use the cookie banner with no cookies dropped until after consent? Will you C, use a cookie banner but still drop cookies before consent is actually obtained? Or are you going to continue and accept the risk of having no pop-up or banner? We'll leave you a few seconds just to answer that.
So the results are up on the screen. As you can see, the majority of people are opting for the cookie banner with no cookies dropped until after consent, with an equal spread roughly of a prior opt-in cookie consent pop-up and cookie banner with cookies dropped prior to consent. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, so with that, I think I'm handing over to James now.
Yes, thank you, Phil. Thanks very much. That was insightful. I'd like to introduce everybody now to James Eyre, Director of Strategic Accounts at Insighten. James has been with Insighten for over 5 years, nearly coming up to 6 now. So very familiar with us, what we do, and many of our clients. He advises them on consumer dating marketing technology, capabilities, and best practices. And prior to that, he actually ran the global technical support for Insighten, so has a lot of insight as to the questions that our customers and clients are posing for him. He has a BSc in Management and Computing from Loughborough University. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to James.
Great, thanks very much. Well, I'd like to start with a checklist of achieving website data GDPR compliance, so kind of following on from what Phil was saying there. So let's begin. Step 1. So the very first thing I think that majority of our customers are doing at the moment, but also I would say that anyone else should adopt, is to audit your website to understand what technologies exist. It's you may feel that you know what technologies are currently on your site, but the reality, can be quite eye-opening. A lot of these scans that I've done in the past, and a lot of digging into detail around what tags and vendors appear on sites. One of the problems that I see quite often is piggybacking technologies. This is where data is being shared with fourth and fifth parties. It's being passed on from the vendors that are currently operating on your site through to further technologies. You need to be able to audit for things like non-secure technologies, firing in secure environments, and also to find out, what technologies on your site that have been there for some time that you may no longer be using. It's quite common to see that, and I'm sure you'll all be familiar with that. As a next step, you need to be able to gather consent. So Phil's spoken quite in depth about the consent and what needs to happen with regards to that, but you must ensure that no technologies and tags fire until explicit consent has been given. And I was very pleased to see the results of the poll just then to say that most people are going to go down that route. You need to be able to detail which technologies are collecting data and why. You also need to be able to capture the opt-in and opt-out decisions and allow the user to change that consent at a later date. As a third step, you need to develop some kind of process to catch the addition of future technologies. Your tagging landscape on your site is changing, I would say, on a daily basis. So whatever process you do put in place, you need to make sure that it will capture any additions to the website at a later date. And really, to be compliant, this needs to be 100% reliable, whatever process you decide upon. And then as a final step is around enforcement. So you need to be able to prevent data collection from unauthorized services. As I mentioned at the beginning there around piggybacking technologies, you need to have some way of blocking that. You need to lock down who has access to your data on your website and ultimately prevent tags from firing when you don't want them to fire. Linking that back to the consent as well, you also need to be able to enforce whatever the customer's wishes are. So each customer will effectively be on your website, and they will opt in and opt out of different technologies, and you need to enforce that. If they don't give authorization for data to be passed to certain vendors, you need to, for them alone, you need to stop that happening. So just to kind of cover off the risks, I'm sure we're all aware of the legal and reputational risks. The fines have already been mentioned already, but actually, the new regulations actually put certain controls in place to stop your business activities if you're not compliant. But one area that you may not have thought of is around the operational risks. So, ignoring the regulations altogether, the fact that you have data being passed around your site and passed to different technologies brings certain additional risks from a technology and operational perspective. Loss of sensitive data is a bad thing. Loss of first-party data. If you have vendors on your site that are collecting your information and passing it on to other vendors, they're effectively taking your customers' information, using it to their own advantage, and in some cases even using this to build their own audiences, which they then sell back to you or to your competitors. So this is this concept of piggybacking tags again that's been brought back. Loss of revenue. If you have unsecured tags in a secure environment, most browsers will pick that up, and your customers will be presented with a warning on their browser, which can increase cart abandonment and ultimately cost sales. And in a very worst case as well, we're dealing with JavaScript here, so it's a quite powerful tool if used in the wrong way. In worst case scenario is that these vendors can inject malware onto customers' machines. Quite extreme, but has happened in the past. So, what can we do about it? So, I've used the framework here of Insighten's privacy solution to illustrate how you can use technology to solve GDPR website compliance. Any solution you choose for website compliance should be able to provide the following 3 areas of functionality. I hope to give you some insight into the types of features that you should be looking out for. So number 1 is around global privacy enforcement. This really refers to website control, as in you'll need to be able to provide a mechanism for controlling what vendors or technologies can operate on your site, and to ensure that no personal identifiable information is leaked. Think of it as like an enforcement gateway or a firewall for data and tags. Second up is gathering of customer consent. So whatever tool you operate with, you need some mechanism of gathering consent. This ultimately will be an interface to collect and manage consent options. And then more importantly, and this is the absolute key factor, is you need to be able to enforce the wishes of each individual customer. A lot of you voted earlier around not firing tags before consent has been given. But then if you're presenting those options to those customers, and every single customer could potentially give a different level of consent for different tags, you then need to enforce those wishes and for each customer ultimately have their own tagging profile on your website. And then finally, reporting. So you need to understand who is actively collecting data on your website. We mentioned that as the first step. So you need some kind of tool for that. You can do a manual approach, but I would say any technology that you choose should have some way of analyzing your site and feeding back who's on there, what vendors can be found, what tags are there, and also going a step further, identifying different potential data breaches, and also highlighting where there have been changes. So if you run one scan one week and another scan another week, identifying what's changed on your website. So digging into enforcement a little bit more. So what is an enforcement gateway? Well, I always liken it to a firewall that by default should block all third parties from collecting data on your website. Unless, of course, you've pre-approved them via a whitelist. But this is quite an important feature. So imagine installing something that effectively blocks all tags from firing, and then you only allow certain vendors to have access to your customer data, and you can choose who they are. At this stage, we're not talking about individual customer consent, but rather as a website owner installing some level of control on who can operate on your site. So the questions to ask when searching for a solution are, can your chosen tool enable you to whitelist only the vendors you want to allow to access your data? And more importantly, can it block everything else? There are a variety of tools out there at the moment that offer you the ability to block certain vendors, but it's the other way around. It's the blacklist approach. They will allow everything to get through, apart from the few that you don't want to have access. The whitelist approach is the opposite. It's by default blocking everything and then only allowing the technologies that you have chosen to operate across your site. And then, more importantly, I would say, tags can be injected into your page through a variety of different ways. It can be through a tag management solution, container tag. It can be through tags that you've hard-coded directly into the page itself, or, as we've already explored, being injected, piggybacking off the back of other tags as well. So whatever solution you have, it needs to be able to stop tags from being injected into your page from pretty much any source that is possible to serve these technologies. And then, can it, and any tool that you operate or look at, can it spot or prevent potential security breaches, such as non-secure tags firing on secure pages? So we've spoken about the control of vendors, tags and technologies, but another important factor to consider is when potential PII is exposed and at risk of being sent to third parties. This is true even if you have a tag control mechanism in place, similar to the one we were discussing on the previous slide. One way of solving this is to use data pattern matching, where you identify sensitive data through its formatting. For example, a construct of an email address, or the 16 digits that make up a card number, or the 11 digits of a telephone number starting with 010203, etc. Technology can then solve this problem at the point that the data is about to be leaked by performing an action on the sensitive data as the tag is due to fire. You don't have to necessarily block the whole tag from firing, but rather mask or remove the offending data from the call. The example is a typical tag being passed parameters. An email address has been set up to be passed as one of the parameters. This is a very realistic scenario. An employee could have set this up totally innocently, and it does happen. So there needs to be a viable way of preventing it from occurring, and this can be done through data pattern matching. So moving on to the final topic I want to talk about, which is around consent. As we mentioned before, one of the key areas of GDPR compliance is consent gathering. So I thought it would be interesting to highlight some of the critical features. Opt-in and opt-in by default. There's not a consensus approach here. So whatever technology you choose, you need to have the choice of being able to operate both. And I would argue that certain technologies you may want to, by default, have opted in, and others you might want to opt out by default. It's really a question of what your legal teams determine is acceptable. But whatever tool you use in order to capture this consent, you need to be able to alter that option easily. Next is obviously enforcement of customers' preferences. So as we've already said, it's not just about gathering consent, but enforcing the individual customer's preferences. Each individual customer will ultimately have their own personalized tagging profile, and for who they're happy to have their data shared with. So you need control. You need to be able to control this and enforce this at an individual customer level. Quite a technical challenge. Retrieval of consent options. So this is interesting. So when a customer returns to your website, either on the same device or a different device at a later date, you need a way of potentially retrieving their previously given options. I mean, it's not critical. You can ask for consent every single time, but this has an impact on the customer experience. So if we can gather consent, we can store that consent and we can retrieve it when the customer returns to the website. It will obviously help minimize the impact on any potential data loss for analytics or marketing purposes. And then finally, alteration of consent, which is again one of the requirements. Once the customer has given their consent, they need to be able to change it at a later date. So some other considerations around consent gathering is obviously the impact on collected data and the business processes. So what you probably want to do here is test out different options. I mean, we've got a small window of opportunities between now and 25th of May to effectively try out different consent experiences, test out different messaging, grouping, whether you group your categories together or whether you list each individual vendor. I think the messaging is going to be very, very important behind this. And also when you're looking at any tool that can provide this, or you're going to develop one yourself, the level of customization behind it, I think, is quite important as well. As you'll need to try out different scenarios in order to minimize that potential data loss. So a few further questions to ask around consent gathering. Some will echo what Phil was saying earlier on, and hopefully a few others that you may have not thought about as well. So can you block data being shared or prevent tags from firing until explicit consent has been given? As we've seen, most websites that you visit today will allow tags to fire on the very first page load. Phil touched on that earlier. Even before a consent banner has been shown. And this is quite common. You go to most websites now and install a tag monitor in your browser, and you'll see that your clickstream data, your IP address, and your behavioral data has been shared with 30, 40 vendors before you've even been given the option of opting in or out of any consent experience. So that's what we'll need to change. Once consent has been given, you can then enforce what that customer has selected. So this is, as I said before, quite a technical challenge. So it's all very well collecting consent, but the action is rather useless unless you can use it to control in real time the technologies that are asking for the data in the first place. And what can you do to minimize business data loss? Well, I'd argue that having total flexibility over the design and features of the consent experience will enable you to minimize the loss of data that you're able to capture. Such as design, the messaging, the grouping of consent options, and also when to ask for consent. These are all important factors that will reduce the impact that GDPR will have on, the inevitable data loss. Being able to call up the consent experience at different times is quite important. So if a customer's come to your website and they've opted into everything, the next time they return, we want to retrieve that consent, but we might not want to show them the consent options again because they've already given the consent. They've opted into everything. That's the best possible scenario for yourselves. However, if that same customer opts out of all tracking, next time they come to the website, we can spot the fact that they opted out previously, and we can choose to show them the consent experience again with an encouragement to try and opt in. Can you support multiple languages and regions? So it's quite an obvious statement, but it's a very valid point. Different customers coming from different areas. If you've got different websites, different domains, you'll need whatever solution you choose. You'll need to be able to manage it in different languages. And can you take a record of the consent? Can it be shared across different regions, domains, and devices? And this is very important. I would say if you have multiple brands, similar websites, even different domains under the same umbrella domains. It's not uncommon to have a booking journey or a white labeled journey that operates on a different domain, or a customer that uses your web properties on 2 or more devices. Any solution should be able to cope with these scenarios. And then finally is how easy is the technology to deploy? Not much to say other than the easier the better, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a trade-off of time and resource versus functionality. So that's everything from me. I think we've got one final interactive poll question before moving on to the question and answers. So the question is, which of the following are ways in which GDPR consent enforcement can be compromised?
So while everyone's filling in this, I also encourage you to use the Q&A panel within your webinar control panel to actually ask questions. We've got a number of questions in there already, but this is your real opportunity to quiz James and Phil on specifics relating to your requirements or your business. Okay, I've closed the poll out there. So quite a strong result there that 82% have gone for all the above in terms of the ways that GDPR consent enforcement can be compromised. So that's tags being served outside of a TMS, approved vendors, non-secure tags on secure pages, and visitor consent not made at real time. So that's very interesting. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating in the poll. I will now go to the questions, and as I say, we have a few questions already lined up. So the first question that we have is, how does the GDPR ePrivacy regulations affect sites hosted and served from outside the EU, such as US-based sites? That's probably relating to a question specifically for Phil. So Phil, can you address that one?
Sure, certainly. So, I mean, I can give you the lengthy legal answer, but the short answer is that if you are intentionally targeting the EU market, so you have websites that are attracting audiences from the EU, and you're providing goods and services into the EU, you are going to be subject to both the GDPR and the ePrivacy rules. And so when it comes to something like cookie consent, you are going to need to think about putting some kind of cookie consent mechanism on your website. One of the things I quite often get asked is, what do you do if you're, if you get both European and non-European audiences to your websites? And commonly, what you'll often find people will do there is that they will work out the visitor's location from their IP address, and then if it's a European visitor, they will display some kind of cookie consent tool, and if it's a non-European visitor, then perhaps they won't. But the short answer is, if you're attracting a European audience, you're going to need a cookie consent solution.
Great, thanks for that. One for I guess this is for you again, Phil. So maybe for James as well. So James may have an opinion. We rely on Google Analytics tracking. If we were tracking whether or not consent has been given, would we have to ask them to agree to consent first?
So, for Google Analytics tracker, I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but if the question is essentially, do we need to get consent when we're using Google Analytics, then yes, it is. You may remember back from the early slides that you've essentially got to get consent for any cookie that is not strictly necessary, and analytics cookies are not considered to be strictly necessary under European law currently. There is a proposal with the forthcoming ePrivacy regulation that maybe analytics cookies will be exempted, but as it stands today, analytics cookies are not strictly considered to be strictly necessary, and therefore you do need to get consent for them, including Google Analytics.
Yeah, just to add to that as well, to clarify what that means from a practical perspective, it will basically mean that any customer visiting your website, you will not allow to serve the Google Analytics cookie until they have given their explicit consent. And only when they've given their consent are you then allowed to fire that analytics tag.
Thank you. Another question. This is a slightly long one. If I've given a website consent to drop cookies on my device in the past, will this consent remain valid after the 25th of May, or will websites have to ask for my permission again once GDPR comes into effect?
That's a very, very good question, and a very difficult question to answer, actually. What the GDPR basically says is that any consents you collected before the 25th of May will continue to remain valid after the 25th of May, provided they were collected to a GDPR standard. So it becomes a little bit circular because, of course, most companies weren't collecting GDPR standard consents before the 25th of May anyway, even if they were having some kind of consent mechanism. Now, that's certainly true if you're collecting personal data from people. What's a little less clear from a regulatory perspective is whether you need to go back and ask people who have previously consented to cookies under ePrivacy rules to have to reconsent again. I think my sort of I guess my sort of practical take on that would be that, technically, probably there's an argument you should ask people to reconsent. I don't expect many people to do it in practice. I think the far more important thing to focus on is just to make sure that you have a GDPR compliant solution going forward.
Thank you, Phil. Now, this next question, it's actually two questions. This relates, I think, to one of the points you made, James, about ensuring that whichever tool you use takes action to make sure that it suspends cookies or doesn't fire tags until consent has or hasn't been given. So this question is probably relating more to Phil. You mentioned before Nike.com and their cookie handling, but before I take any action there about the cookies, the set already had nearly 20 cookies loaded. Is this allowed?
It's interesting you say that, actually, because I must admit, I've gone to Nike's website myself in private browsing mode, so no prior cookie set, and used a tool to actually track how many cookies are dropped on me when I land on Nike's page. And actually, before I consent to cookies, I certainly don't get anywhere near 20 odd cookies being dropped. I do get a couple of cookies being dropped, and my guess would be they're cookies that Nike are classifying as being strictly necessary cookies, because one of them is a tag management cookie. So I suspect it's using a solution that is actually stopping the other cookies being served until you click through to get consent. When you do click consent, then yes, a whole bunch are dropped on you. But if you want to see another example of a website that uses a sort of similar approach but doesn't drop any cookies on you at all when you first land on the page, I would say have a look at Microsoft's website. When you first land there, you will find you get a banner at the top of the screen that tells you that continued browsing of the website will amount to consent. But actually, when you first land on Microsoft, they don't drop any cookies at all. It's only when you subsequently navigate to another page and your continued browsing amounts to consent that they then drop cookies on you at that point. But I'm afraid with Nike, I can only say that I've had a different experience when I've tested it myself.
Okay, thank you. The second part of that question was about cookies relating to setting language and/or currency, and whether those cookies are allowed to be set before consent.
Yeah, but believe it or not, those cookies are still considered not to be strictly necessary cookies. They're what regulators would term as sort of preference cookies. And so, you have a preference to see a page in a particular language, or you have a preference to have prices displayed in a particular currency. But from a regulatory standpoint, they are technically considered not to be strictly necessary cookies. And so, if you're following the letter of the law, then you do need to get consent for those cookies as well. Whether websites do that for those types of cookies is a slightly different thing in practice, but technically they would fall within the consent requirement.
Great, thank you.
If there's, I can answer, just add a little bit more to that. If there's the option to select your language or region on the website, as there often is, how we've come across this from an Insighten perspective in the past was to combine both the language and region selection with the consent options within the same interface. So you get presented with your opt-in and opt-out of tags, but also your language settings all in one area. So you select everything in one go.
Thank you, James. Just as there's been a couple of questions about whether the presentation will be distributed to the attendees afterwards. The answer is yes. The recording and the presentation will be distributed within hopefully today, if not tomorrow. The next question, I think this relates more to James, about you mentioned that you often see multiple layers of tag piggybacking. How often and how much of a problem is it really?
I would say every single website I've worked on and run any kind of audit across in the past has had some level of tag piggybacking. So it's, with pinch of salt, I'd say pretty much every single website out there suffers from this problem. Some technologies and some vendors that operate, rely on this piggybacking capability. Ad network pixels or retargeting vendors will inject further ad network pixels into the page. That's just how they operate. I could give you a live example. I'll say a very recent example. Tuesday night, I think Google's DoubleClick server went down, which meant that any DoubleClick calls on the website would effectively cause an error, and customers would see that. So the customer I was with at the time decided they were going to remove their DoubleClick tag from their page in order to prevent that error from occurring. And what they didn't realize is that actually there's about 5 or 6 DoubleClick calls on their page. So when they removed the one that they had control of, there was still another 5 operating on the site. And we actually dug a little deeper and found that these DoubleClick tags were being injected by some of their other vendors. So in that case, it was quite obvious because each one of them was causing an error, but up until that point, they hadn't actually noticed that they were there. So it's a very, very real problem. And I've highlighted, I think, on one of my slides earlier around some of the operational risks that come with that. Not just obviously being in breach of GDPR, but also it can actually have an impact on your site performance as well.
Okay, thank you. Phil, this one's directed at you. You mentioned earlier on that you would give your view on opt-in versus implicit consent. Can you expand on that view, please?
Yeah, certainly. So this kind of goes back to some of the slides I was presenting earlier, and I mentioned there were the kind of 2 models for getting consent. One is to have a kind of a strict opt-in where no cookies are set, in theory, like the Nike model, where until you click yes, I agree to cookies, no cookie is set at all. The other is the implied consent model, where you basically tell people that you're going to set cookies if they continue to use the website. Now, personally, I believe that actually both solutions work, and both solutions work post GDPR. But the big difference is, as I was mentioning on the earlier slides, is around the timing of the cookies. Today, the way that people generally use that implied consent solution is to serve the cookies at the same time as the cookie banner is being displayed. So in other words, the first time you know about the cookies are after they've already been dropped, and you're kind of told that your continued browsing of the website will amount to your ongoing acceptance of those cookies. With the GDPR, though, because there is this requirement for the consent to be unambiguous, I think if you're going to use that implied cookie banner approach, you have to display the banner before any cookies actually get dropped. So it can still be implied consent in that you're not actually asking anybody to say, yes, I agree to cookies or anything like that, but you are basically informing them before the cookies are dropped that continued use of the website will amount to consent, and then you are waiting until they actually take an action on the website, in other words, clicking on a link, which constitutes their acceptance, their consent, and then only at that point are you then serving the cookies. And as I say, a nice example of that is if you go to the Microsoft website, that's exactly the model that they use currently on their site.
Thank you. And just sort of following on from that, the one question that we've just had come up is, surely you need a cookie to record the lack of consent. Is that allowed?
Actually, I would normally say it's the other way around. You need the cookie to record the opt-out. Often the way things work. If somebody consents, you can obviously set a cookie on their computer to say this person has consented, and and then every time you see that person again, you can check the cookie to see whether they've consented, and you don't need to present them with a cookie banner again. If they haven't consented, I guess the position would be that you don't need to set a cookie on their device to record the consent, and so next time you see them again, if there's no cookie there, then then you would present them with a consent banner again. So if you were going for the kind of the very strict approach of waiting until somebody actively consents before serving them cookies, then I think you would only actually need to serve a cookie once they had consented. If you were going more on the model though that we're only going to serve cookies, or we will serve cookies unless people opt out, then you're quite right. In order to record somebody's opt out, you would serve a cookie on their computer to reflect the fact that they've opted out. So it really depends, I guess, on the consent model you're going to use, whether you're going to use a more active opt-in model, or whether you're going to work on the basis that their browsing of the website kind of amounts to consent unless they opt out.
Okay, so if you didn't record their non-consent, then every time they came back to the site, you would need to ask them again, in effect.
If you didn't record their non-consent, yes, that's correct.
Cool. Okay, thank you for that. And then there's quite a few questions around the requirement for GDPR in the US, which I know you've answered slightly before. But if you could expand on that, and also in addition to that, for a UK site, do we have to ask for consent for a US visitor to that site?
Sure. Okay. So the GDPR applies whenever you are providing goods and services to individuals in the EU, even if they're free goods and services. So if you have a website that is directed towards European visitors, then the GDPR will apply, cookie consent rules will apply, you will have to have a cookie consent tool. Now there is a bit of question around what does it mean for a website to be directed towards the EU, and if it's the case that you're really just a US website selling to a US audience and you happen to get a bit of incidental traffic from the EU, I wouldn't worry about it. But certainly if you are intentionally directing your services towards Europe, or if you're using localized EU domain names .co.uk, .de, .fr, or you're translating into local languages, or you're accepting local currency payments from the EU, absolutely without question, you'll be considered to be subject to the GDPR and need to have a cookie consent tool. For the reverse situation, if you are a UK business or an EU business with a UK or EU website and you're getting visitors from the US, I'm afraid technically, yes, you would still have to display a cookie consent mechanism. The GDPR also applies to any business that is established in the EU, regardless of where they are collecting data from. So the long and short of that is, if you're a business in the EU collecting data from all around the world, you're always going to have to display some kind of cookie consent mechanism. If you're a business outside of the EU, then you'll have to display a cookie consent mechanism and be subject to the GDPR if you are selling into Europe.
Great, thank you. Just on the Nike, I've just checked, and they are using doing tracking, or they certainly were with me. So the person who brought that question up, Michael, you are correct. And then another question. This one I think is more for James. You mentioned the whitelisting of tags. What are the benefits of the whitelist over the blacklist?
Yes, so the whitelist approach, I would say, is far more robust. It will, as I said before, it will effectively block any single, at a network request level, any single tag from firing until you as a business have determined or have allowed that tag to fire. So effectively what you're doing is, by default, everything's blocked apart from the tags that you want to fire on your site. The blacklist approach is, I would argue, probably not compliant even, because you go down the route of allowing every single vendor to operate on your site apart from the tags that you add to the blacklist. And that doesn't really include the catch-all, whereas from a whitelist approach, it does.
Thank you. And I think this will probably, just looking at the times, will probably be our last question. Phil, I think this is directed at you. What about cookieless environments like in mobile?
Well, that's a very good question. So if you think back to when I showed you the language in the ePrivacy Directive about the requirement for what we call cookie consent, you'll remember that it actually never uses the word cookie. What it talks about is access to or storage of or access to information already stored on a device. And so it actually applies equally to mobile as it does to to websites. But in the mobile domain, most apps will instead rely on getting sort of mobile device identifiers like sort of the iOS IDFA or the Android Ad ID, and that is information that is stored on the device that the app is getting and it's using for tracking or tagging purposes. So actually, the consent requirements apply equally to mobile as they do to the kind of the desktop type environment. From a regulatory perspective, I'd say there's currently much more awareness of and enforcement of the issues in the desktop environment because, regulators aren't desperately sophisticated, and so they understand desktop better than they understand mobile. But the rules actually apply equally across both.
Great, and this is probably quite a quick one for you. You mentioned the ePrivacy regulation, the ePrivacy Directive regulation. Do you have any idea of date when that will come in? Because I know there's been a few sort of rumored dates. They were trying to get it to fall in line with the 25th of May. Do you have any insight as to when that will happen?
It's absolutely not going to happen by the 25th of May this year. There's an awful lot to be worked out on it, and the legislative parties that are debating it are still quite a distance apart in some of their positions. To give you a sense of where we're at, to get the new law passed, you have to have the Parliament and the Council at the European level have to kind of agree on what the law looks like. At the moment, the Parliament has prepared their version of what they like the law to look like. The Council has not yet finished reviewing the legislation, decided what it thinks its version should look like. Then when they agree that, they have to get together and negotiate, to reach a consolidated position. When they've done that, they then have to take the consolidated draft back to both houses to vote upon, and then when it's voted upon, it has to go. If it passes, then it has to go into the official journal of the EU, and it's 20 days after it gets published that it then becomes law. Even with the best will in the world, if they were to reach, if we were to be in a really good position today, you'd be looking at least 6 months from now. And I think more realistically, you're looking at something closer to 12 months or possibly beyond.
Great. Okay. Well, there are a couple of other questions still unanswered, so we'll try and address them outside of this session because we're coming to the top of the hour. So at this point, I'd just like to thank both Phil and James very much for their insightful presentations and their question handling. I think we've all learnt something from them. If you want any more information on either Phil Fisher or Insighten, then please let us know. I hope you found the session useful, and I thank you all for your participation and for your questions. The recording, as I mentioned, and presentation will be distributed later, but if anybody has any other needs or requirements or any follow-up questions, then please let us know. So thank you very much again, everybody, and we'll be in touch soon, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.